The world did not end the day Rome fell, but for the people living through it, it felt dangerously close, because when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it was not marked by a single explosion or final battle. It was a slow unraveling of authority, memory, and order, a giant system rotting from the inside, while enemies pressed from the outside. And by the time the last emperor, Romulus Augulus, was quietly removed in 476 AD, Rome was already a shadow living off its past, its roads cracked, its cities shrinking, its armies filled with mercenaries who no longer fought for Rome but for pay. Loyalty to emperors replaced by loyalty to survival. And what followed was not an instant dark age, but a long, painful transition where Roman power vanished, yet Roman habits refused to die. Because even as imperial rule disappeared, Roman law, language, and infrastructure still shaped daily life across Europe, while former Roman lands were carved up by new rulers who did not see themselves as destroyers, but as heirs. Men like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks, who moved into Roman territory not to erase it, but to control it, settling among Roman populations, marrying into Roman families, adopting Roman titles, and ruling over cities that still spoke Latin and still remembered what it meant to be Roman. Even though the taxes stopped coming, the legions no longer marched, and the central government was gone, leaving local elites, bishops, and warlords to fill the vacuum, especially the church, which quietly became the most stable institution left standing, preserving literacy, records, and a sense of continuity while emperors came and went. And as the West fragmented into competing kingdoms, the East watched carefully, because the Roman Empire did not truly die in 476, it simply split its fate, with the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, surviving with its capital at Constantinople, rich, fortified, and still very much Roman in identity, law, and ambition, while the West struggled to redefine itself, its cities shrinking as trade collapsed, long-distance commerce fading, coins disappearing from daily use, and power becoming personal rather than bureaucratic, based on land, loyalty, and force, not paperwork and imperial decree. Yet even in this chaos, Rome's influence lingered everywhere, in roads still used, in laws still cited, in the idea that civilization meant order, writing, and rule. And the fall of the Western Empire did not mean people forgot Rome overnight. It meant they argued over who had the right to claim it, who could call themselves Roman, who could rule in its name, and whether Rome was a place, an idea, or a memory, a question that would shape Europe for centuries to come, as kingdoms rose from the ruins, not as barbaric destroyers, but as uneasy successors, standing on Roman foundations while slowly building something new, something unstable, something that did not yet know it would become medieval Europe.
As the dust settled across the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire, power no longer flowed from a distant emperor, but from whoever could hold land, command warriors, and negotiate with the church. And this shift reshaped daily life in ways ordinary people felt immediately, because without imperial taxes, the massive Roman bureaucracy collapsed. Aqueducts went unrepaired, roads were maintained only when locals needed them, and cities that once thrived on imperial salaries and trade began to shrink into fortified towns, while the countryside grew more important than the old urban centers. And in this vacuum, the so-called Barbarian kings stepped in, ruling not as foreign conquerors, but as Roman-style monarchs, issuing laws in Latin, minting coins with imperial imagery, and presenting themselves as protectors of Roman order, even though their power rested on personal loyalty and military strength rather than institutions. And among them, the Visigoths carved out a kingdom in Gaul and later Spain, preserving Roman law for Roman subjects while living under their own traditions, while the Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great ruled Italy itself, attempting one of the most ambitious experiments in post-Roman governance, where Roman administrators ran civil affairs and Gothic warriors handled defense, creating a fragile balance that kept Rome's old structures alive longer than anywhere else in the West. But this balance was always temporary, because without a strong central system, everything depended on the competence of individual rulers, and when strong kings died, their kingdoms often fractured, leading to constant conflict, instability, and shifting borders. while further west, the Franks emerged as one of the most successful post-Roman powers, not because they rejected Rome, but because they adapted to it better than most, especially after King Clovis converted to Christianity, aligning himself with the Roman Church and gaining legitimacy among Roman populations, allowing Frankish rule to blend Roman administration, Christian authority, and Germanic warrior culture into something durable, something that would outlast most other successor states. While elsewhere, the Vandals in North Africa demonstrated how fragile Roman recovery could be as they seized Rome's richest grain supply, weakening Italy itself, showing that control of resources mattered more than imperial titles. And throughout all of this, the Church expanded its influence quietly but relentlessly, as bishops became judges, negotiators, and leaders, monasteries preserved texts, and Christianity provided a shared identity in a world where Roman citizenship no longer meant anything. And by the 6th century, Western Europe was no longer Roman, but it was not entirely non-Roman either. It was a hybrid world, stitched together from fragments of empire, tribal traditions, and religious authority, a world where people still walked Roman roads, prayed in Latin, followed Roman law, and lived under kings who claimed Rome's legacy even as they ruled in its absence, setting the stage for centuries of struggle over power, faith, and identity in a land still haunted by the shadow of an empire that refused to be forgotten.
While the Western lands adjusted to their new rulers and improvised systems of power, the Eastern Roman Empire moved in the opposite direction, tightening its grip on authority and preserving the illusion of an unbroken Roman world. Because from Constantinople, the emperors still saw themselves as the rightful rulers of all Roman territory, including the Lost West, and this belief shaped everything they did, especially under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, a ruler obsessed with restoring Rome's former glory, not as nostalgia, but as policy. And Justinian launched ambitious military campaigns to reclaim Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, briefly pulling large sections of the former Western Empire back under imperial control. And for a moment, it seemed as if Rome might be reborn. Laws were reorganized into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal system so influential it would shape Europe 1,000 years later. Massive building projects like the Hagia Sophia proclaimed imperial power, and Roman identity remained strong, centralized, and confident in the East. But this restoration came at a terrible cost, because endless wars drained the treasury, devastated the countryside, and exhausted the population. And when plague struck in the 540s, killing millions, it exposed how fragile even the Eastern Empire truly was, forcing Constantinople to abandon many of its Western reconquests, leaving Italy shattered by decades of war and vulnerable to new invasions like the Lombards, who carved out their own kingdoms amid the ruins, proving that once Roman order was broken, it could not simply be rebuilt by force. And this divergence between East and West became permanent as the Byzantine Empire evolved into something more Greek in language and culture while still calling itself Roman, while the West drifted further from imperial traditions, losing centralized administration, professional armies, and urban life, replacing them with local rule, agricultural economies, and warrior elites. And as long-distance trade collapsed further, wealth became land-based, power became personal, and loyalty was enforced through protection rather than law, planting the seeds of what we now recognize as feudal relationships. Even though people at the time had no concept of living in a Middle Age, they were simply surviving in a world where Rome no longer provided stability. And yet Rome's ghost still dictated ambition, because kings continued to crave Roman legitimacy. Church leaders framed authority through Roman concepts of order, and even the Byzantine emperors never stopped seeing the West as lost provinces rather than foreign lands, a tension that would simmer for centuries, shaping wars, diplomacy, and identity, as Europe slowly transformed not through a clean break with the past, but through centuries of adaptation, failure, and compromise, trapped between the memory of empire and the reality of a fragmented world struggling to define itself without Rome at its center.
By the 7th century, the consequences of Rome's collapse were no longer temporary disruptions, but permanent realities, and the landscape of Europe reflected this deeply. Because where imperial frontiers once controlled movement, new borders formed around kingdoms, rivers, and mountains, isolating regions from one another and accelerating cultural divergence. Latin itself slowly breaking into regional dialects that would one day become French, Spanish, and Italian. While in Britain, Roman rule had vanished almost completely, cities abandoned, villas crumbling, and new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rising with little attachment to Roman identity, showing how uneven Rome's legacy truly was, strong in some regions, faint in others. And as the Byzantine Empire turned its attention eastward to survive new existential threats from Persians and later Arab armies, the West was left to develop alone, no longer protected or supervised by imperial authority. And this separation reshaped Christianity itself, because while the Church had once been part of the Roman system, it now became its own source of power, with the Bishop of Rome gradually emerging as a figure of authority, not because of armies, but because Rome's symbolic weight still mattered, allowing the papacy to claim moral leadership in a fractured world, mediating disputes, crowning kings, and presenting itself as the last living link to the Roman past. And this alliance between kings and churchmen became the backbone of Western stability, fragile but functional, as monasteries spread across Europe, turning wilderness into farmland, preserving knowledge through copying manuscripts, and acting as economic and spiritual centers in a landscape where cities were rare and insecure. And slowly, almost unintentionally, a new order formed, one based on personal bonds of loyalty between lords and warriors, land exchanged for service, protection for obedience. Not because anyone planned feudalism, but because without Rome's bureaucracy, there was no other way to organize power, and the memory of Rome became less about reality and more about aspiration, something rulers invoked to legitimize themselves, something scholars studied as a golden age, something the Church used to frame order and authority. And this memory reached a turning point in the year 800 when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope, an act that openly admitted Rome was gone, yet desperately needed to be reborn in some form, creating a new Roman Empire in the West that was Roman in name, Christian in ideology, and Germanic in practice, proving that Rome after the fall was not a corpse, but a resource, endlessly reused, reinterpreted, and reshaped. And by this point, the transformation was complete. The ancient world had faded into something unrecognizable, yet never truly disappeared, because Europe was no longer Roman, but it could not stop defining itself in relation to Rome, living in its shadow, chasing its authority, and building a new civilization from the fragments it left behind, unaware that this long, painful transition would one day be remembered not as chaos, but as the beginning of a new era.
Even after new kingdoms stabilized and the memory of Rome softened into legend, its collapse continued to shape Europe in quiet, structural ways that people rarely noticed but constantly lived with. Because the disappearance of a unified empire meant knowledge itself became localized, uneven, and fragile, concentrated in monasteries and courts rather than shared across a connected world. And while monks preserved texts, much was lost simply because it was no longer useful in a rural, survival-focused society. Advanced engineering faded, literacy narrowed to elites, and education shifted from civic participation to religious devotion. Yet this loss was not total decline, but redirection, as Europe adapted to its circumstances, developing new technologies suited for agriculture like heavy plows and crop rotation, slowly increasing food production and population, laying foundations for future growth that Rome itself never achieved at scale. And this gradual recovery was uneven because regions that retained Roman infrastructure, like parts of Italy and southern Gaul, recovered faster than areas where Rome had barely taken root. And this imbalance hardened regional identities, turning Europe into a mosaic of cultures rather than a single civilization. And as generations passed, people stopped thinking of themselves as fallen Romans and began seeing themselves as Franks, Lombards, Saxons, or Christians first, while Roman identity shifted upward, becoming something claimed by emperors, popes, and scholars rather than ordinary people. And the Byzantine Empire, still calling itself Roman, watched the West change into something increasingly foreign, its Latin past replaced by new languages, customs, and political systems, making reunion impossible. And yet Rome's collapse also created space for innovation, because without imperial control, power was contested, negotiated, and reshaped constantly, allowing new ideas about kingship, law, and faith to evolve. And by the time Europe began reconnecting through trade and learning centuries later, it was no longer trying to rebuild Rome, it was building beyond it, using Roman memory as a foundation rather than a blueprint. And this is the true legacy of Rome after the fall, not a sudden descent into darkness, but a long transformation where collapse forced reinvention, where loss created diversity, and where the end of empire made possible the emergence of medieval Europe, a world different, fragmented, imperfect, yet resilient, shaped as much by Rome's absence as by its enduring shadow.
As Europe moved deeper into this post-Roman world, the absence of empire began to feel normal rather than traumatic, because generations were born who had never seen a Roman official, never paid imperial taxes, and never imagined a single ruler controlling the entire continent. And this psychological shift mattered as much as political change, since people stopped measuring their lives against Rome's standards and instead built meaning around local power, land, and faith. And this is where the social structure hardened, as warrior elites became hereditary nobles, peasants became bound to land for protection, and authority became something you could see and touch rather than something issued from a distant capital. And while this system limited mobility and freedom, it also provided stability in a dangerous world, making survival predictable even if opportunity was rare. And meanwhile, the church expanded into this gap left by Rome, not just spiritually, but administratively, because bishops organized cities, monasteries managed land, and church courts handled disputes, effectively replacing Roman civil institutions without openly claiming to do so. And this gave Christianity enormous power over daily life, shaping moral rules, social norms, and political legitimacy, as kings increasingly ruled by God's will rather than Roman law. And yet, even as Rome faded from living memory, it returned in intellectual form, because scholars in monasteries studied Roman texts, preserved Latin, and framed history as a fall from greatness, planting the idea that the past was superior to the present, a mindset that would dominate medieval thinking for centuries. And beyond Europe, Rome's fall reshaped the wider world too, because the weakening of the Mediterranean network shifted global power east and south, where Islamic civilizations would soon rise, preserving and expanding Greek and Roman knowledge that the West had forgotten, while Byzantium acted as a bridge between ancient and medieval worlds, defending Roman law, diplomacy, and statecraft long after the West abandoned them. And this separation meant that when Europe eventually rediscovered Roman learning, it would come back transformed, filtered through Arabic scholars and Byzantine tradition, proving that Rome did not die in one place or time, but scattered across civilizations. And by the end of this long transformation, the fall of Rome could no longer be seen as a disaster alone, but as a turning point that shattered unity to create variety, ending an ancient world built on empire and replacing it with many smaller worlds built on culture, belief, and survival, each carrying fragments of Rome without ever being Rome again.
By the time Europe entered the later centuries of this transformation, the idea of Rome had become more powerful than Rome itself ever was in its final years, because it no longer needed to function to inspire ambition, authority, and legitimacy. and rulers who had no direct connection to the ancient empire still framed their power through Roman memory, adopting imperial titles, legal language, and symbols to elevate their rule above rivals, while ordinary people lived lives completely detached from imperial concepts, focused on harvests, local disputes, and protection, showing how Rome split into two existences, one symbolic and one practical. And this divide shaped medieval politics deeply, because kings who could associate themselves with Rome, either through the church or through claimed imperial succession, gained an advantage in a fragmented world hungry for order. And this is why conflicts between emperors and popes became so intense, as both claimed to be the true heirs of Roman authority, one through power and law, the other through faith and moral legitimacy. And this struggle defined Europe's political evolution, preventing any single power from fully recreating Rome's centralized control, while paradoxically keeping Rome's influence alive through constant competition over its legacy. And beneath this high-level conflict, everyday Europe continued to change as trade slowly revived through river networks and regional markets. Towns re-emerged as centers of exchange rather than administration, and money cautiously returned to circulation, marking the beginning of economic recovery that Rome itself had once taken for granted. And with this revival came a renewed interest in law, record-keeping, and education, fields deeply rooted in Roman tradition, showing that Rome's collapse had delayed these systems but never erased the need for them. And meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, though weakened, continued to act as a reminder of what centralized Roman rule looked like, influencing diplomacy, military organization, and religious debates across Europe, even as cultural distance grew. And when Byzantium finally fell centuries later, it would do so as the last living witness to ancient Rome, confirming that Rome's story was not a straight line, but a long echo, fading differently in different places. And by this stage, the fall of Rome could be understood not as a moment, but as a process stretching across generations, reshaping identity, power, and belief so slowly that no one living through it could fully see what was being lost or created, only that the world their ancestors knew no longer existed, and a new one, uncertain yet adaptable, had taken its place, carrying Rome forward not as an empire, but as an idea that refused to disappear. As this new world matured, the long shadow of Rome continued to influence how Europeans explained their past and justified their future, because history itself became a tool of power, written and preserved by those who benefited most from Roman memory, especially church scholars who framed the collapse as moral decline, a punishment for corruption, luxury, and paganism, reinforcing the idea that spiritual authority now mattered more than imperial strength. And this narrative shaped how medieval people understood time, dividing it into a glorious ancient age and a flawed present struggling toward salvation. And this way of thinking slowed innovation in some areas, but deepened discipline, order, and continuity in others, especially within religious institutions that outlived kingdoms and dynasties. And while political borders shifted constantly, the church's structure remained remarkably stable, creating a shared cultural framework across Europe that Rome once enforced through law and armies. And in this sense, Christianity succeeded where empire failed, binding diverse regions together not by force, but by belief, rituals, and shared stories. And yet the Roman past still quietly guided material life, because medieval law codes borrowed Roman principles, land ownership followed Roman precedents, and even medieval architecture reused Roman ruins as foundations, literally building the future on the physical remains of the past. And this reuse was not just practical, but symbolic, a statement that Rome's authority could be inherited, transformed, and repurposed, not destroyed. And as centuries passed, this relationship with Rome became less emotional and more strategic, especially as emerging states began to consolidate power, using Roman concepts of sovereignty, taxation, and written law to strengthen control, proving that Rome's collapse had delayed centralized authority but never eliminated the desire for it.
And beyond Europe, Rome's fall reshaped global connections because the fragmentation of the West reduced Mediterranean trade while strengthening regional networks, pushing innovation inward rather than outward, while the Islamic world, inheriting and expanding Roman and Greek knowledge, surged ahead in science, medicine, and administration, creating a contrast that would later shock Europe when contact resumed. And this delayed reunion between Roman knowledge and Western ambition would eventually ignite profound change. But for now, Europe remained a world defined by adaptation rather than expansion, by memory rather than empire, slowly evolving under the weight of a past that was gone in reality but alive in imagination, guiding choices, shaping institutions, and reminding every generation that even the greatest powers could fall, leaving behind not ruins alone, but lessons written into the structure of civilization itself.
By the later medieval period, the consequences of Rome's fall were no longer debated as loss alone, but absorbed into how Europe understood power, progress, and legitimacy, because the idea that civilizations could rise and collapse became part of political thinking, shaping how rulers planned for continuity, succession, and stability, lessons learned painfully from Rome's slow decay. And this awareness encouraged stronger dynastic rule, clearer inheritance laws, and tighter alliances between crown and church, all attempts to avoid the fragmentation that followed imperial collapse. And yet fragmentation never fully disappeared, because Europe's strength now lay in diversity rather than unity, in competing centers of power that pushed one another to adapt, innovate, and survive. And this competitive environment slowly accelerated development, especially as trade routes reopened, towns expanded, and a merchant class emerged that did not fit into the old warrior-peasant structure, challenging feudal norms and demanding written contracts, standardized laws, and financial systems, many of which drew directly from Roman legal concepts, revived not out of nostalgia but necessity. And this revival of Roman ideas became more explicit as universities formed, studying ancient texts not as sacred relics, but as practical guides, marking a shift from preservation to reinterpretation. And this intellectual awakening revealed how deeply Rome still structured European thought, even after centuries of separation. And while the Byzantine Empire remained a distant reference point, its existence reinforced the idea that Rome had never truly vanished, only transformed. And when Byzantine scholars later carried ancient knowledge westward, they would reconnect Europe with parts of its Roman past it barely remembered, accelerating cultural change. And all of this confirmed that Rome's fall did not end history, but reoriented it, breaking a single system into many paths that eventually crossed again. And by this stage, Rome had become less a model to restore and more a warning to study, a reminder that scale, bureaucracy, and power could collapse under corruption, inequality, and overstretch, lessons medieval rulers absorbed unevenly but never ignored. And in this way, Rome continued to govern Europe long after its emperors were gone, not through armies or laws, but through memory, precedent, and fear of repeating the same fate, shaping a continent that moved forward not by escaping its past, but by constantly negotiating with it. As Europe moved toward the threshold of the modern world, the fall of Rome increasingly looked less like a catastrophe and more like a necessary fracture, because without that collapse, the rigid structures of empire might have frozen development rather than allowing it to evolve. And this realization slowly changed how thinkers interpreted Rome's legacy, shifting from mourning its loss to analyzing its limits, its dependence on conquest, slavery, and endless expansion, systems that could not sustain themselves forever. And this critical view mattered because it freed Europe from the obsession of restoration and replaced it with the ambition of improvement, encouraging states to borrow selectively from Roman models rather than imitate them blindly.
And this selective inheritance can be seen in the rise of stronger legal systems, centralized taxation, and standing administrations that echoed Rome but were adapted to local realities, avoiding the overextension that destroyed the empire. And culturally, Rome's collapse created space for identities rooted in language, region, and shared history, allowing nations to form where provinces once existed, turning fragmentation into foundation. And even the Church, once Rome's spiritual successor, began to face challenges as monarchs asserted authority independent of religious approval, a reversal of earlier medieval power dynamics that traced directly back to the vacuum Rome left behind. And beyond Europe, Rome's fall continued to shape global perceptions of power, because later empires measured themselves against Rome, consciously comparing their rise, peak, and decline to its example, using it as both inspiration and caution. And this universal framing turned Rome into a template for understanding civilization itself, making its fall one of the most studied events in human history, not because it ended the world, but because it revealed how worlds change. And by this point, the transformation that began in 476 had fully unfolded. The ancient Mediterranean-centered system replaced by a Europe defined by multiple centers of power, dynamic economies, and evolving political thought. And Rome's story reached its true conclusion not when the last emperor fell, but when Europe finally stopped trying to be Rome and instead learned how to live with Rome behind it, as memory, lesson, and warning, shaping the future not through domination, but through understanding, proving that the end of empire was not the end of civilization, but the beginning of something more complex, adaptable, and enduring.
In the end, the fall of Rome was never about ruins, invasions, or a single lost throne. It was about transition, about how a civilization learns to exist after the system that defined it disappears. And Europe's answer was not immediate recovery or total collapse, but centuries of adjustment, conflict, and reinvention, where people stopped waiting for Rome to return and started building lives without it. And that choice, slow and unplanned, mattered more than any battle or emperor, because it allowed new political ideas, social structures, and identities to grow in the empty space empire left behind. And even when Rome was invoked again through emperors, popes, or scholars, it was no longer a living authority, but a reference point, something to interpret rather than obey. And this shift marked the true end of the Roman world, not in 476, not with invasions or decrees, but when memory replaced governance, when law became tradition, and when power learned to justify itself without imperial command. And from that moment onward, Rome belonged to history, not because it was forgotten, but because it was understood, studied, reused, and finally surpassed, leaving behind a legacy that shaped Europe precisely because it was incomplete, fractured, and human, reminding every generation that even the greatest empires are temporary, but the ideas they leave behind can outlive stone, armies, and crowns, guiding civilizations long after the empire itself has fallen.